Hello viewers, this video is an in-depth look about the 94 calls to action. In Canadian high schools, many people receive knowledge about the 94 calls to action. However, it is important to further research and understand the details of the calls to action and how they've advanced over the years. Specifically, this video will be looking at the calls to action in relation to Indigenous women's rights. So, what are the calls to action? The 94 calls to action were created by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. It is a document including 94 calls to action directed to the Canadian government to right the horrifying wrongs of the residential schools. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission defines the 94 calls to action as actionable policy recommendations meant to aid the healing process in two ways: acknowledging the full horrifying history of the residential school system, and creating systems to prevent these abuses from ever happening again in the future. The goals of the 94 calls to action were to teach all Canadians the reality of Indigenous peoples' treatment throughout history, and to create educational and economic opportunities for Indigenous Canadians so they can fully participate in society. It is meant to vastly improve life for Indigenous peoples in Canada, ensure through education that something like the residential schools never happens again, and to dismantle systemic racism. The creator of the 94 Calls to Action, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was established in 2007 as part of the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. They created their final report of the calls to action in 2015, which contained information gathered through 6 years' worth of interviews and conversations with survivors of residential schools. The signing and acceptance of this report established a new, renewed nation-to-nation relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canada. The 94 Calls to Action looks at the following categories: child welfare, education, language and culture, health, and justice. As the Calls to Action document was created in 2015, you may be wondering how the Calls to Action has advanced and been carried out over the past few years. Subnote, the use of the word Aboriginal in the Calls to Action was proper language used in that time, but today can be a bit outdated. The word Indigenous will be used instead when talking about the Calls to Action. In regards to the progress of the Calls to Action, as of June of 2022, 13 of the calls to action have been completed. 8 in regards to reconciliation, 2 in regards to justice, and 3 in regards to language and culture. 19 of the calls to action have not started, meaning no action plan has been developed and no funds have been committed to implement these calls. 31 of the calls are in progress, meaning the projects have been proposed and relevant parties involved have either committed to an action plan or funding, but not yet followed through with it. 31 are in progress with the proposed projects underway, meaning relevant parties involved are actively working towards implementing that call, with both a timeline where needed and funding to make it happen. When researching any history, it is important to take an intersectional approach. Google defines intersectionality as the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. Sexism and racism often interact, causing multiple levels of injustice, especially for women of color. We need these frames of intersectionality to see how different people are affected in a targeted group. It is important to research issues with an intersectional approach so stories are explored to their fullest and most accurate extent. For example, in the book, the historian S. Curandera explains that telling undertold stories is important, usually for minority groups, and centering women changes the landscape of history. Putting women as the main characters also changes history. Different questions are asked and different answers are brought forward. Daniel Heath Justice explains in his book that in Indigenous history, women were the leaders, the directions, the decision makers. Women continue to be counted on in life. Heath explains that the love of Indigenous women is powerful, and this power has been targeted by the forces of misogyny and patriarchy. Therefore, it is important to research the calls to action through different lenses, for example, how it is related to Indigenous women's rights. The calls to action speak about Indigenous peoples as a whole. They do not really go into talking about specific groups throughout the document. Most of the categories can be related to Indigenous women, but do not specifically refer to them, except for call number 41. This call states, "We call upon the federal government, in consultation with Indigenous organizations, to appoint a public inquiry into the causes of and remedies for the disproportionate victimization of Indigenous women and girls. The inquiry's mandate would include investigation into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, links to the intergenerational legacy of residential schools." According to CBC's Beyond 94 reports, this call to action is classified as complete. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls released its final report at a closing ceremony held June 3, 2019. The report concluded missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls are victims of a Canadian genocide, and commissioners issued 231 recommendations. This was met with criticism that its mandate did not go far enough. It could not order police to launch investigations or reopen cases previously closed. The inquiry also could not compel governments or agencies to implement its recommendations. The federal government first announced the launch of a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in December 2015. In August 2016, it announced the details of the inquiry. The expected cost would be $53.8 million, and it would last 820 days, to be wrapped up by December 2018. In early 2018, the inquiry's commissioners asked for a 2-year extension and $50 million more. In June 2018, the federal government gave the inquiry until April 3, 2019 to submit its final report, and until June 30, 2019 to wind down its operations. In terms of additional funding for the extension, the federal government provided $21.3 million over 3 years to increase health supports and victim services for survivors and families. $5.42 million to extend the availability of family information liaison units and funding for community-based organizations to support families beyond the life of the inquiry. $10 million over 2 years to establish a commemoration fund, $1.25 million over 2 years to fund organizations with expertise in law enforcement and policing to lead a review of police policies and practices, and $9.6 million over 5 years to support the Royal Canadian Mounted Police's new National Investigative Standards and Practices Unit. Although Call 41 in the calls to action is classified as complete, there's still a lot of work to do in regards to reconciliation, specifically for reconciliation in regards to Indigenous women. In conclusion, researching the 94 calls to action is important for understanding how policy can be implemented in the Canadian government for changing the discriminatory system against Indigenous peoples. In history, Indigenous people are often portrayed as nothing more than the victims and oppressed. Therefore, it is important to study organizations such as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to change the narrative of how we look at history. Further, intersectionality is important for a complete understanding of the subject at hand. In conclusion, I hope you enjoyed this video on the 94 calls to action, and I hope it provided more information on something that is touched on in our high school classes, but does not go into much details. Thank you for listening.